Hello, my name is Johnny and I'm one of the SWAT coaches here at Bradford College. This video is going to be looking at how to do criticism of sources. In particular, we'll be looking at using Google Scholar, and then at the end of the video we'll go through writing a critical paragraph. So the essay topic that we're going to be looking at here is to do with resources in a classroom and whether or not teachers should have or use coloured overlays. In particular, this is related to the idea of Erlin Syndrome, a syndrome whereby reading, particularly off a white and black, can be very difficult. The words can swim or move or become blurred. So when I started this topic, I didn't know anything about Erlin Syndrome. And if you don't understand the keywords in a question, the first thing to do is quick research. That means looking at Google or YouTube to see if there's any source out there that can easily and quickly explain the topic to you. So I did this, and I quickly searched for and found this video, which is called Understanding Erlin Syndrome and the Erlin Method. And I discovered that this woman in the video, Helen Erlin, discovered the syndrome and prescribes a variety of different coloured overlays and lenses to help with the reading problem. Now, one of the interesting things with this is that she was described in the video as a CEO. And my first thought was that if she's a CEO, she must run a company. And if she runs a company, what connection has that got to do with Erlin Syndrome and the Erlin Method? So I typed Helen Erlin into Google and I got to her website, the Erlin Institute. And part of the Erlin Institute has this shop in which she sells Erlin branded products related to Erlin Syndrome. So my initial reaction was, of course, that something seems a bit off, that she is making money out of the syndrome that she claims to have discovered. It makes you think that there's a real chance there for bias. So having seen this and got this sense of bias, the next thing I did was to look at Discover Bradford to see if I could find any academic articles perhaps which were quite critical of Erlin Syndrome and questioned whether or not even it was real, or perhaps whether these coloured overlays were effective. So I searched Erlin Syndrome on Bradford, and I got to this article, The Effect of Coloured Overlays and Lenses on Reading, a Systematic Review of the Literature. This is from 2016. And I thought, fantastic, this is just going to give me an overview. So reading through it and looking at the abstract, two key things jumped out to me. We have this quote here, where it says the majority of studies are subject to high or uncertain risk of bias, with studies at lower risk from bias providing less support. So essentially, they used a thing called the Cochrane Risk of Bias tool and decided that lots of the studies which have said that the overlays are effective are in fact biased, and therefore the results, are questionable. This leads to them saying, we conclude that the use of coloured lenses or overlays to help reading difficulties cannot be endorsed. Now, I've worked in schools and I've seen these coloured overlays being used frequently, so to see that the idea that they could not be endorsed at all, and that the benefits reported by individuals are likely to be the result of placebo, practice or Hawthorne effects, which is a type of expectation, a type of guessing, was surprising. So, knowing that this was the case, I decided to look if there'd been any criticism of this article. So I took the title and I go to Google Scholar. Type in Google Scholar into Google. Here it is, Google Scholar. And I pasted in the title, press search, and Google finds it straight away. Now, Google has this very useful feature. Google Scholar has this very useful feature called Cited By. And that allows you to look at more recent articles that have cited this particular article. So it's an instant way of finding criticisms of an article or support for an article or other related articles, which there is also a search function for. So I pressed Cited By, and I got to this article here, Risk of Bias in Assessing Risk of Bias, which is by a man called A.J. Wilkins, who was important in the field. And he made he responds to their review basically saying it is biased. He says here, under double mask conditions, agreement between judges using the risk of bias tool, which the previous people who wrote the review did, is so poor as to suggest the assessments of this kind have questionable validity. So he's saying that the tool they use to assess risk of bias is ineffective. He goes on to say, more strongly, the waste paper basket method of simply designating studies as having a high risk of bias and then ignoring their findings needs to be replaced by a more nuanced approach, i.e. the people who wrote the review ignored evidence, possibly because they were themselves in fact biased. So that's very interesting. So he's saying that actually the review is not really to be trusted. So my next thought was, okay, well he's criticizing a tool which they must be using. Perhaps somebody has criticized this person. So we go back to Google Scholar, back to this article, and we can see that yes, this has been cited by some other people. So people have responded to this letter. So if we click on here, we get to this article, Cochrane Risk of Bias. And so I thought, oh, well, let's have a look. And in fact, this article is written by people from editors of the Cochrane Eyes and Vision Group, so people who must use or develop this tool, the Cochrane Risk of Bias tool. And they say, in response to the man writing the letter in response to the review, that the tool itself is fine, but the original review did not in fact do it properly, saying because they did not conduct a meta-analysis, an analysis overall of everything, their review is systematic, but its analysis is narrative. Therefore, narrative summaries allow more room for subjectivity and may sometimes be misleading. I.e., the people who use the tool in order to dismiss the evidence in the first place did the tool wrong. They themselves open themselves up to bias when looking at bias. So, in total, one review said that the evidence for the effectiveness of overlays was lacking, that they weren't effective. The response to that said, actually, you possibly are biased in your assessment. And the third person said, yes, they very possibly are biased in their assessment. Remembering that my essay is about the use of resources in the classroom, I can now come to some kind of conclusion about whether a teacher should keep sets of these overlays to use with certain students. And my opinion out of all of this is basically it's up to the teacher. There is obviously no evidence either way, and a single systematic review is quite successfully criticized by at least 2 other people. Therefore, a teacher should just take those overlays if they want to, do some research themselves, and try them out. And if they're successful, use them, and if they're not, don't. I now need to write that opinion up into a paragraph. And this is what I have here. So at this point in the video, I'm just quickly going to go through this paragraph and afterwards provide some resources that people could use to practice the skills in your own writing. The first thing to show with this paragraph is that I have an introduction and a conclusion. The little introduction to the paragraph, or the opening of the paragraph, clearly states my point. The teaching practitioner must rely in part on their own judgment when deciding to have coloured overlays as classroom resources to aid reading. So that's my point. My little conclusion summarises the evidence that I give in the paragraph, repeats that point, and then makes a suggestion for something to do with the future. There is clearly no consensus amongst researchers as to the efficacy of these learning aids, and therefore practitioners will be responsible for doing their own research or experimentation in the classroom with coloured aids to make a decision on this matter, i.e. the teaching practitioner must rely in part on their own judgment. I've mentioned this idea of experimentation in the classroom with coloured overlays because my next paragraph is going to be about experimentation. And I want to cue the reader, I want to signpost to the reader that something else is coming related to this topic. But the important bit for us to look at now is how I've written up the evidence that we've just walked through. So I start by saying there have been few systematic reviews and no large-scale randomized tests of their effectiveness in supporting reading. And that comes, in fact, from Griffiths, the people who wrote the review that we're criticising. But it's an important point just to say that the evidence is not there. A recent review came to a conclusion that these learning aids cannot be endorsed, and any benefits reported are likely to be a result of placebo praxis or Hawthorne effects. My reference? So I've summarised what their conclusion was in a single sentence, using a mixture of quotes and paraphrase. Despite the strength of this conclusion, so I'm saying that even though they say this, however, their review has been criticised for its use of the Cochrane risk of bias tool in a way which places studies designated by the authors as having a high risk of bias, principally those supporting use of coloured overlays lenses, in the waste paper basket and ignores their results. So that sentence, all it does is it summarises Wilkins' argument, and it's this little phrase, despite the strength of this conclusion, that tells the reader that all of this information is in contrast to the stuff that's just come before. So far we've got a single statement, a summary of Griffiths, a summary of Wilkins' response, and then I go on a little bit more detail with Wilkins, saying how Wilkins also highlights how the Cochrane risk of bias tool is itself open to bias and has been reported as ineffective. So I'm just building on that criticism and highlighting another aspect of it. Bunce et al., 2017, editors of the Cochrane Eyes and Vision Group, responded to Wilkins' criticism of the Cochrane risk of bias tool by stating that Griffiths had not, in fact, used the tool correctly. So here again, I'm summarising what they say, relating it back to the fact in front, and then I go into a bit more detail again. They said that the review failed to include a meta-analysis, leading to a narrative analysis being presented, which, they suggest, allows more room to be subjective and misleading. And then I give my final reference. So in each case, I'm summarising the overall argument, or I'm giving a specific fact from that argument, and following it up with another summary or another fact that directly links to the one in front of it. None of the sentences in this argument, in this paragraph, are standalone. They all of them have some kind of a link to the one before or the one after. And when you're writing your paragraphs, this is what you're attempting to do. It's to weave together, it's to sew together, it's to blend your information from your sources in a way that leads to a final point, in a way that leads to an idea, which in my case is there isn't enough evidence, do whatever you feel like. I hope that's been helpful to see a full example of what criticism actually looks like and how it's a good way to achieve it using Google Scholar. If you want to look into this in more depth, I recommend using the Bradford College SWAP cheat sheets, which are available on the Moodle on the front page, particularly the ones about the body paragraph and evidence sentences in the body paragraph. There's a very useful resource from Manchester University called the Academic Phrase Bank, which gives lots of sentence structures for, amongst other things, comparing and contrasting sources. And the final very useful resource is search on Google or on YouTube for examples of academic criticism or critical writing. Thank you for watching this video, and I hope it was helpful in some respect. Goodbye.